what exactly is knowledge? That's really the question. What is this knowledge? And that's what I started my talk off with anyways, right? What is this knowledge? You see, the sciences of the Sharia are approximately 11 sciences. Okay? How many? Give or take, there are 11 sciences. These are the core sciences. And these sciences of the Sharia, they can be divided into two categories as well. Those sciences, or those subjects that are basically the primary subjects. Okay? This is what everyone is aiming for. They call these the ghaiyat, the things that everybody's aiming for. And then you have the alat. Then you have the tools. These are not directly related to the Sharia, but they are needed in order for you to be able to understand the Sharia as well. Okay? In terms of the primary sciences, they happen to be, can anybody guess? Quran, obviously. That would be a primary science. Because Quran has many things related to it, by the way. What else? Sunnah, Hadith. Okay? Seerah. This is also a primary science. Aqidah and fiqh, these five. If you look at any Islamic university, they will always have something focused around these five. You'll have a kulliyat al-Quran, you'll have a kulliyat al-Hadith, you'll have usul al-Din, which is aqidah, and then you have sharia, which is fiqh, and seerah is basically incorporated in all of these anyways, right? So these are the five primary sciences. These are the goals that everyone is trying to achieve when you're learning the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If you learn these, basically you are a learned person, you are a scholar of the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There are no other sciences which are considered goals when you're learning the Sharia except for these five. Everything else is a tool that you learn in order for you to understand these five. Okay? As for the tools, there are a number of tools as well. These tools happen to be, first and foremost, the language. Okay? The language of the Arabs. Number two is usul al-fiqh. The principles through which you can understand fiqh or deduce rulings. Number three, mustalah al-hadith, which is basically the principles through which you can tell whether a hadith is authentic or not. Number four is, some deem it important, others don't give it that much importance, but the idea is this is the science of logic, okay? This is important because a lot of the early scholars, they would write their books in codified with some terms related to logic. So if you don't understand those terms, when you go read the books, if you're reading the word jins or fasl or any of these things, you won't understand what it says. Because these are all codified within this particular art, which is the art of logic. Logic is available in English as well, but again, if you don't know it in Arabic, you're going to not be able to understand those particular technical terms, right? These are generally the fields, and I said 11 because Arabic is divided also further into three sciences, because Arabic is the syntax, which is nahu, and it is the morphology, and last but not least balagha. And balagha is further divided into three as well. But I'm just summarizing for you, 11 sciences, okay? So, it is these sciences. Each one of these can be studied from various angles. You know, when you come to the Quran, you have the recitation of the Quran. You have the 7 qira'at or the 10 qira'at or the 14 qira'at, and at least a person should be able to read the Quran properly in one riwayah of one of the qira'at, at least as a bare minimum. That's the Quran. And you also have within the Quran, ulum al-Quran itself, the sciences of the Quran, which are many, at least 40 to 50 plus sciences, as listed by Zarkashi in his book Al-Burhan fi Ulum al-Quran, and also more than that in the book Al-Itqan of As-Suyuti. And this is Ulum al-Quran. Then you have the tafsir of the Quran itself. So the Quran, you're looking at it from three different angles. Number one, you're looking at it from the angle of recitation, correcting your recitation. And what does that mean? Correcting your recitation based on the qira'ah that you recite. All of us pretty much recite Hafs and Asim, right? There may be some people that recite something else, but mostly everybody recites that. So you go to a shaykh, you recite the entirety of the Quran, so you can perfect your recitation and you know how to now read the Quran properly. Number two, you go and learn the ulum al-Quran. Number three, you learn the tafsir of the Quran. When it comes to the hadith, there's two angles of the study of hadith. The first angle of the study of hadith is the isnad of the hadith, the chain of the hadith. Okay? And that is whether this particular narrator happens to be an authentic narrator or this is not an authentic narrator. Okay? Acceptable or rejectable narrator. I mean, there's a lot to say there. And also whether this particular person reported from that person or not. Is there a broken chain we're dealing with? And things of that nature. So this is the ilm al-riwayah. And then you have the understanding of the hadith itself. Because someone can say, well, this is clearly said in a hadith, but then you take the hadith and you apply some of the tools that you learn in the tools, you understand something completely different now from the hadith that the person maybe in a translation of the hadith may not have seen. So that's why you have all those tools, the Arabic language and all of those things. Okay? طيب. So this is when it comes to hadith. Now in Aqidah, you have all of the basics. And what are the hadith books? I mean, there are the 6 main famous hadith books that everybody knows as As-Sihah As-Sitta. And then there are other hadith beyond that, the 9 books. And so there's primary texts. These are the 9 books. Then there are secondary texts, which are also texts that are looked to by specialists in the field. And then there are tertiary texts, which are usually looked to only by very, very elite scholars in the field of hadith, because they're the ones who have already spent their whole lives reading through the primary texts and the secondary texts and the tertiary texts. And that's why I want to clarify an important myth over here. And that is that some people say, okay, it's not in Bukhari and not in Muslim. It doesn't exist. It's not like that. You might not even have a hadith in Bukhari, Muslim, and the other 4, Sunan ibn Majah, Sunan al-Tirmidhi, Sunan al-Nasa'i, Sunan Abi Dawood. You might not have it in the Muwatta. You might not have it in Musnad al-Imam Ahmad. You might not have it anywhere in the primary texts. You might not have it in any of the Masanid that are famous. But then you go to some of the Musannafat and you find the hadith over there. Are we going to just leave the hadith because it's not in the primary text? No, there's the same system, which is the system of chains. You have to look through the chains, whether they're authentic, they're acceptable, how the scholars, they dealt with this hadith in early generations, what early scholars had to say about this particular hadith. So there's an art. You can't just say it's not in Bukhari, not in Muslim, doesn't exist. I couldn't find this hadith. It's not there, or not on sunnah.com, right? No, it's not like that. There's a lot more than that. طيب, anyways, so these are the hadith books. But if a person has looked through at least the 6 books, they've looked through a lot of the Sunnah. I would say 95 to maybe even 97% of the Sunnah, because most of it is recorded within these books. Everything else, there is rare exceptions to the fact that most of the Sunnah is recorded here, but most of it is there. You can, through other chains, it may be available elsewhere, but most of it is still there. This is the hadith. Then you have the Seerah. When it comes to the Seerah of the Prophet ﷺ, you learn it from a number of different angles. You learn the things that are specific to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. These are known as the khasa'is. Those things which are very particular to the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. Then you have, and there are a number of books written on this topic, like the khasa'is of As-Suyuti and many other books on khasa'is. Okay? Then, and also Ash-Shifa, very famous book of Al-Qadi Iyad. And then you have the Shama'il of the Prophet ﷺ, which is basically the personality and the physical traits of the Prophet ﷺ. Then you have the actual lifetime, the ghazawat of the Prophet. They call it the ghazawat, but they're not only talking about the battles in there, they're going to be talking about many other things as well, right? So then you have the actual life of the Prophet, and the most famous book on this particular subject is the Seerah of Ibn Ishaq. We don't have all of it today, but Ibn Hisham, he summarized that book. So he gave us a summarized copy of Ibn Ishaq. Ibn Ishaq is not completely available today. We only have a portion of it. But we have the summary of Ibn Hisham of that book, which is equally valuable. Okay? Or which is very valuable as well. So, and by the way, in each of these fields, there are scholars who have very strongly specialized in this field. Meaning, they may be great scholars of this field, but they may not be in another field as good as well. Okay? In fact, and you may be surprised to hear this, you may have a Qari of the Quran who is one of the Qurra as-Sab'ah, or the Ruwat of one of the Qurra as-Sab'ah, but he is not acceptable in the science of Hadith. Because this is his field. He spent his whole life memorizing the Quran and sticking to the Quran, and this is a task. People sometimes forget that this is really a task. If you want to dedicate yourself to knowledge, this is a task. If you want to dedicate yourself to the Quran, this is another task. You're going to have to spend 2-3 hours a day reviewing daily. This is a complete task. So you might have a Qari of the Quran, one of the Sab'ah, one of the Ruwat, one of the later Ruwat, who's a great Qari. You know, if you tell him to read from Fatiha till Nas, he'll do it without a mistake. But when it comes to Hadith, we'll say, okay, this guy. So some of the Orientalists, what they'll do is they'll take these type of facts and they'll say, but the Muhaddithin, they say this guy is weak. We say, because it's a different science. This is his field. You go into Seerah as well, Ibn Ishaq, someone might say something about him. But he's a strong scholar in Seerah, he might not be in Hadith. Do you understand? So, that's the Seerah. And then you have, after the Seerah, you have the fiqh as well. And fiqh is, in Sunni Islam, normally fiqh is taught within the spectrum of one of the 4 madhahib. Okay? These 4 madhahib, there are schools of thought. They're not schools that omit hadith, as some people claim. Some people have the idea, misconception, that the madhahib of al-Islam, the 4 madhahib, al-fiqh, al-Hanafi, al-Shafi'i, al-Maliki, and these madhahib, they don't even consider hadith. It's completely untrue. Imam Ahmad is basically the founder of one of the 4 madhahib. He is the man who wrote Musnad al-Imam Ahmad, which is the biggest book on hadith. There is the hadith book of Imam al-Shafi'i as well, Musnad al-Shafi'i. Imam al-Shafi'i has his own hadith book. In fact, Kitab is one of the sources of hadith as well, because Imam al-Shafi'i is often quoting a hadith in there. Sometimes he's quoting with a chain as well. Imam Abu Hanifa has multiple books of hadith attributed to him. Imam Malik is the author of Muwatta. So how did these people not know any hadith, or they completely forgot about hadith, or they are some of the narrators of hadith. They're very well aware of hadith. They may even be aware of the hadith that you're quoting to say that this person's madhab is wrong, but they have another understanding of that hadith. Maybe you're unaware of that understanding. No, let me put it this way. You're likely unaware of that understanding, but he's aware of that understanding because he's lived with these scholars of hadith in the same era, and so he's heard all of the conversations that are taking place over there. So they're not rejecting hadith because you find a hadith opposing one of the madhahib. They might actually find this hadith to be daif, for example. It's a weak hadith. Or they might have 2 opposing, contradicting hadith, and one of them prefers one over the other, and so on and so forth. So these madhahib, this is how Islam has been taught throughout the centuries. Now there used to be other madhahib as well, by the way. In early Islam there used to be the Laythiyah, right? Who used to follow Al-Layth ibn Sa'd. And there used to be the Thawriyah as well, who used to follow Sufyan al-Thawri. And there used to be the Tabariyah as well. Imam al-Tabari, he used to have his own madhab. And it ended up dying. And if you read his book on tafsir, you'll realize that actually Imam al-Tabari is of that caliber. He has his own madhab, and really it's a very strong pursuit of knowledge that you find within his books, in his tafsir. You can tell this person is a mujtahid. The Shafi'iyah, they have a tendency of saying that Imam al-Tabari is actually Shafi'i, but the reality is if you really look his works, at his works, you'll find that this person is a mujtahid. Oftentimes, not even sometimes, not oftentimes, many times in his book, Imam al-Tabari is contesting Shafi'i very, very harshly so as well in his tafsir. So how can he be Shafi'i when he's very harshly contesting a Shafi'i? And from the language you can't see that type of feeling in al-Tabari as well, the way he writes. So and it's historically a fact that there used to be a group of people who would follow his madhab. It was known as al-Tabariya. But around the 5th, 6th century, all of these other madhahib, they died. Okay? They all died. And the only madhahib that remained were basically the 4 madhahib. Okay? And the followers of them. And there were a couple of other madhahib as well. For example, the Ibadiyya, they have a claim, which is an offshoot of the Kharijites. They have a claim that their madhab, it has an unbroken chain to Imam Zayd. But, wallahu a'lam, because they have 2 centuries of no writings in the middle as well. So, the idea is generally when it comes to Sunni madhab, these were the ones that people learn. And the reason why it's important to learn through one of them is because it gives you a way of thinking. That's the important part. It's not about following every nitty and gritty. I personally grew up studying the madhab of al-Shafi'iyya. I don't follow every nitty and gritty of the Shafi'iyya. Even when I'm giving fatwa, I don't necessarily adhere to everything related to the madhab of al-Shafi'iyya, because we're living in a global village where circumstances require sometimes for us to look through all of the opinions and the different evidences and try to come to a reasonable conclusion on things. So we may not have that all encompassed in one madhab, but at least it gives you a framework by which you can think. Because remember, this madhab, what it's doing is, there's rules for deduction. You take these rules, you look at the Quran and Sunnah, and now you apply these rules, and you deduce a ruling. Okay? So this is when it comes to fiqh. And then we have aqidah as well, which are basically the foundational principles of belief. They have been summarized in variant books. One of the most widely accepted books on this particular topic is the Aqidah of Imam al-Tahawi. Okay? And really, the Aqidah is found in the Quran and Sunnah generally. As you're reading the Quran and Sunnah, you're going to learn a lot of the Aqidah as well. So these are the 5 subjects which are considered the goals. They're called the ghayat or al-ulum al-ghaiyah, the ulum that you're trying to achieve, the main goals. And then you have the tools. When it comes to these tools, you have first and foremost the Arabic language. By the way, even though I started with the tools, the goals, you're supposed to learn the tools first. Because that's when you're actually going to be completely enabled to be able to learn those subjects. Because you're going to need usul al-fiqh when you're dealing with fiqh. You're going to need mustalah al-hadith when you're dealing with hadith. You're going to need mustalah al-hadith even when you're dealing with tafsir actually. Because tafsir books are filled with hadith. You're going to need the language in every single field, right? So in the language you have syntax, okay, nahu. This is a very, very important subject. This is what allows you to be able to speak and read properly. Because the thing about it is, Arabic doesn't necessarily have vowels, okay? All the time. The books that you're going to be reading, they won't always have vowels. And in order for you to know how to read the words, you need to, how to read specifically the endings of the words, you need syntax to be able to decipher that. Otherwise, you're never going to be able to read properly. And if you don't read properly, you're going to misunderstand the sentence as well. مثلا, if I say ضرب الفضل الحسن. Al-Fadl is a name. Al-Hasan is also a name. If I say ضرب الفضل الحسن, depending on how I pronounce the last letters of each one of those names, the different person will be striking. ضرب means to hit. Okay? Grammarians, they always use the word ضرب as an example. Why? Because they're trying to scare the kids. So they will say ضرب الفضل, for example. I'm just making up this example. الفضل الحسن. If I say al-fadlu al-hasana, that has a meaning. If I say al-fadla al-hasanu, it has a meaning. How are you going to discover that? You're going to discover that through grammar. Okay? Now, some of the early scholars, they didn't have access to these. When they started learning, they also needed to learn the science in order for them to be able to pronounce things properly. Because notice that in a very early time, a lot of non-Arabs, they started coming into Islam in heaps, in very large numbers. So the Arabic language, it became diluted really fast. People started to lose the natural sense of language. Okay? There are a lot of people who are coming into this culture and they don't know how to speak. And that's why Ali ibn Abi Talib, he was the one who commissioned the writing of the science of syntax. He told Abu al-Aswad al-Duali to go and write. He said that Arabic language is ismun wa fi'lun wa harf. It's noun, and it is verbs, and it is particles. And when he said that, he told Abu al-Aswad al-Du'ali, he told him, "Unhu hadha al-nahu." Write just like this, meaning complete the subject. I gave you the beginning and the keys to the subject. Now it's your duty to write the rest of the subject. So he went and wrote the subject. Why is he writing the subject? Because even Ali ibn Abi Talib, in his time, he recognized, the Khalifa, that people are coming in very large numbers into Islam and they're bringing foreign languages, so people are going to start forgetting our language. So we need to have an art to be able to preserve it. So that's why they did it. And that's why a very famous scholar by the name of Al-Qaffal, he started studying Islam at the age of 30. And he said that when I started learning, he's a Qaffal, what does that mean? Locksmith. Literally used to be a locksmith. And he said that I was trying to, when I started coming towards knowledge, I tried reading a book, and in the beginning of the book, it says, اختصرته. Okay? I summarized it. And this is a locksmith, he's grown up in a Muslim society, he's an Arabic speaking individual, and he said, I didn't know how to read it, whether I should say اختصرته or اختصرته. Because without this art, even if you happen to be an Arab, you might make lots of mistakes. You won't be able to understand as well. So he's growing up in learning Arabic, but now he's trying to memorize a book. He doesn't know how to pronounce it. He doesn't know whether he should say, I summarized it or you summarized it. Naturally, if you're reading a book and someone is saying, I summarized this book from XYZ, is it I or you? It's obviously I. But in Arabic, it's just a vowel difference. Fatha or a dhamma. So you have to learn this art then, nahu. And then you have the art of morphology. And to people learning Arabic as a second language, this is a more important subject. Meaning this is the subject you need to be starting with. For people who grew up learning Arabic, for them it's, and they're just trying to fine-tune their language, for them the first subject is more important. Because they already know how to make up words. All they're trying to do is now correctly speak and make sure that they place the object in the right place and the subject in the right place, and how to formulate sentences now. That's syntax, that's nahu, grammar. But then morphology, sarf, is more important for those who are learning Arabic as a second language, because this teaches you how to make words. Okay? You need to know how to make words as well. Okay? So this will teach you how to make words. Without knowing how to make words, you can't make sentences. So unless you have the words down, you can't get the sentences down. If you know how to make the words, now you can go to the other thing, which is how to make sentences. Okay? And that's why pretty much all of the Arabic curriculums for non-Arabic speaking people that are written in the Arab world, they all start with syntax. Because they don't really know how to deal with a non-Arab. They all start with syntax, and that's why the students that learn in that way, they don't end up coming out very strong. Because they never end up learning morphology properly. Okay? Whereas pretty much all of the curriculums written for non-Arabic speaking people, in the non-Arab world, they start with morphology, but there's barely any focus on syntax. At least practically speaking. So you have to combine the two. First, you start and memorize the morphological tables. And that's literally, it takes 1 month to do it maximum. It's quite literally that long. No more than that. It shouldn't take you any more than 1 month, no matter how weak your memory is. Okay? After you're done memorizing that, then you go to the next subject. You're done morphology. You know how to found words now. You know how to make words now. Now you go to syntax and you start formulating sentences. And if you collect those two methods, the method of teaching Arabic as a second language in Arabia and teaching Arabic as a second language in non-Arab world, you're going to come out very, very strong, because you'll be collecting both forms of study that way. Okay? So after you're done morphology, you're done syntax, now you go to the third subject, and that is the subject of balagha, which is basically the philosophy behind both morphology and syntax. It's going to philosophize for you. Okay? You put the subject here and the object here. Why did you put it this way? That's what balagha is going to teach you. Okay, so basically it's the philosophization of the other two subjects. Again, there's no point in learning this subject unless you've mastered the first two, which is syntax and morphology. طيب. Then you have, so now we're done with all of the subjects related to language. Then you have usul al-fiqh. These are foundational principles that you have to know in order for you to know anything when it comes to the rules of Allah Azza wa Jal. Okay? Like oftentimes, we have, and this is a good thing and a bad thing, we have a perception that we only have the Quran and Sunnah. This is good, because yes, when it comes to primary sources, we only have the Quran and Sunnah. But when it comes to sources of knowledge as evidence, you have the Quran, you have the Sunnah, you have the Qiyas, the analogical reasoning, you have ijma', you have consensus. You have other scholars like Malik, they will say the amal ahl al-Madinah, the actions of the people of Medina, because he grades it just like a hadith. He thinks that since the people of Medina in his time, and he's in the first 100 years, in his time, if the people of Medina are doing one way, that means they would have taken it directly from the Prophet or the elderly Sahaba. So it must be like a hadith, even if I don't have it verbatim. So he has amal ahl al-Madinah, he treats it like hadith. Okay? Then you have al-masalih al-mursala, the benefits that don't really have a clear passage on it. Okay? Then you have many other evidences which are considered sound evidence in the Sharia. As soon as you go to any Sharia school, you'll soon discover that yes, it's Quran and Sunnah, but it's actually a little bit more than that. Because Quran and Sunnah leads you to other evidences as well, like ijma', like qiyas, like al-masalih al-mursala, like amal al-Madinah, like other things. Now some of those are disputed, but at least four of them are almost agreed upon, which is what? أصولنا القرآن ثم السنة وبعدها الإجماع فاسمعنا وبعده ما صح من قياس أحكامنا قامت بذي القسطاس. That our usul happen to be Quran, Sunnah, Ijma' and Qiyas. These are the ones that most of the scholars over history have agreed about. So you have to now know the sources of what is halal and what is haram. You understand? If you don't know the sources to how to discover halal and haram, then maybe you might say to someone, give me a hadith on this. There may not be a hadith, there may be an ijma', which is stronger than a single hadith by the consensus. You have an ijma' of all of the scholars, a consensus of all of the scholars on an issue. Okay? Then you say, give me a hadith. There's no hadith on it. That ijma', if it's a conclusive one, it's a stronger evidence and knowledge than a single hadith. Because a singular hadith could be weak, or it could be authentic, it could be misquoted, there could be a lot of things that could happen. But here, it could be misunderstood as well. But here you have the understanding of all of the scholars of Islam from all of their reads of the Quran and the Sunnah and all of the athar of the Salaf, etc. Right? So obviously this is stronger as an evidence. So you have to know where each evidence falls as well. This is usul al-fiqh. And then you can understand fiqh as well, and you'll be able to better deal with the Quran and the Sunnah as well when you have this tool. Okay? So it gives you the art to be able to deduce things. How do you look at a hadith and you say, oh, this means this is an obligation? You go to usul al-fiqh, and that's where you learn that. طيب. Then you have mustalah al-hadith, which I spoke about a little bit, but I'll tell you a little bit of it. So these are basically, this is the art that grades different hadith. Okay? You have authentic hadith. You have Hasan hadith. You have da'if hadith. And you have mawdu' hadith. Da'if is weak hadith, but there's so many different types of da'if. There are da'if hadith because the person didn't really have good memory. There are da'if hadith because there's a broken link in the chain. If there's a broken link in the chain, where the broken link occurred, that also has a very serious impact on how you deal with the hadith. So this is a complete art because you don't just say, okay, even when it's a weak hadith, there's a way to deal with it. Sometimes you may have a weak hadith, but all of the scholars in Islam, they accept it. All of them. But the chains from an art perspective, they're all weak. You have Shafi'i, Malik, Abu Hanifa, you have Imam Ahmad, you have all of the big mujtahideen. Every single person is accepting this hadith even though it happens to be a weak one. So there's a whole art that teaches you how to deal with this hadith and how to define whether it's weak, and if it is, what type of weakness it is, and whose hadith are considered acceptable. Sometimes there's a specific narrator, like Sa'id ibn al-Musayyib, for example. Sa'id ibn al-Musayyib he has marital ties with Abu Huraira, one of the relatives. Okay, so Imam al-Shafi'i, he said, even though Sa'id is not a Sahabi, he said, I'll accept all of the hadith of Sa'id. Why? He said, because I looked at every single hadith of Sa'id and I found that he's taking it from Abu Hurairah but just dropping him. But he's never met the Prophet. He says, the Prophet said. Right away. Imam Shafi'i said, I've looked through all of his hadith, every one of them. Every single time he says the Prophet said, he's taking it from Abu Hurairah, but he's dropping that link. Just to summarize, like we say the Prophet said, I don't give you the chain every time. I have chains in all of the books of hadith, alhamdulillah. But I don't sit down and say haddathana, haddathana, haddathana all the way to Bukhari and all the way to the end of that, right? Because I just say the Prophet said and that's it. So sometimes even at that time, some of the scholars would just say the Prophet ﷺ said and that's it. So that's another art. And then we have the art of logic. The reason, again, logic is one of those subjects that you may need and you may not need. Okay? If you're intelligent, you're already logical. So you don't really need someone to give you rules of how to be logical. Okay? But you may need it from another angle, and that is that when you're reading books, there's going to be terms in the field of logic that will be used, and you may think they mean something, but they mean something else. You understand? Especially when they're doing definitions. When they bring certain words, you'll be like, okay, what does this mean? Look up in the dictionary, but that's not, the dictionary meaning is not intended. The meaning, the technical meaning defined in the art of logic is what's intended over there. Other than that, you don't really need the field of logic too much, in my opinion at least. طيب, so this is the general overview of knowledge.